like to move into the next suite of 3 presentations. We'll be hearing next from Randy Wilson with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife on the topic of migratory birds. Again, please hold your questions, and hopefully we'll come back to some of these again, at least the transmission topic again after this next week. So off to you, Randy.
Okay, thanks, Eric, and thanks to BOEM and the task force for inviting me this afternoon to give a little overview on migratory birds and their pathways. And so I kind of opted to go this direction in that the last month or so I've gotten, probably 100 phone calls and emails like, where's the birds in the Gulf? Where's the pathways? What should we be worried about? I'm like, well, it depends, because the birds are everywhere. And so kind of the take home from this story will be, it depends. So I'll explain that as kind of as I go along. So next, I realize I can't click. And so why is the Gulf so important? Why are we worried about it? And so essentially all roads lead to the Gulf. If you look at the picture on the left, the graphic, you can see that about half of the birds that breed in the US and Canada find their way through the Gulf of Mexico at some point during their annual life cycle. Whereas the graphic on the right shows we're not just limited to North America, we're also pulling birds off the coast of Africa into the Gulf of Mexico to spend some part of their annual life cycle here as well. Next. And so what species are we talking about? So there's right at about 400 species of birds, 53 different families that are utilizing the Gulf. So it makes it a really complex puzzle to put together when someone asks you, so where's the bird pathways, right? And so like, well, which bird are you talking about and what time of year? So this is kind of that depends. It's going to be really critical that we be really explicit in our conversations when we talk about impacts to birds moving forward. Next. And so just as a kind of a frame of reference, a recent paper estimated about 2.1 billion birds are migrating through the Gulf of Mexico during spring. You can see the kind of the timeline there. About 75% of those birds are moving through by early May. Next. As with all things, there's a footnote, right? So this the modeling effort that Horton et al. Undertook used weather surveillance radar, but it only looked at nocturnal migrants. So it does not account for any diurnal migration efforts, nor does it account for resident birds that are there breeding. This was only 2.1 billion for nocturnal migrants. Next. So kind of as another common question, so when is migration? So things that we need to be thinking about as we look about siting of the turbines and the maintenance and operation of those. So spring migration is typically March through mid to late May, and then a fall migration kicks in around August and runs to about October. Next. But then again, there's always a footnote, right? So not everybody plays by the same games. So things like some of the waterfowl will initiate their migration off the coast, going back towards Canada in February, but they may not even show up until November. Where some of the other species that are overwintering in Central and South America, they may actually show up early, like in late January and February. So again, there's some generalities, spring migration and fall migration, but there's always these outliers that kind of don't follow the rule set. So we need to be aware of that sort of information. Next. And so kind of following on that same line of thinking, so when is migration? I made reference to both nocturnal and diurnal. Well, the answer is it's both. And so a lot of the hawks, falcons migrate during the day. They can take advantage of daytime thermals. Some of the other species, swifts and swallows, they're aerial insectivores. They can forage on the wing. So a lot of times they're migrating during the day. Whereas some of the smaller, passerines, flycatchers, etc., are migrating at night. It offers a mode of protection from the hawks and falcons, but also the atmosphere is a little less turbulent. Cooler air temperatures facilitates migration, regulation of body temperature, and also the stars and moons provide a navigational aid for some of these species. Next. So where are the pathways? How do birds migrate around and through the Gulf? Well, there's two forms or two modes. It's what we call trans-Gulf flights, where birds go straight across. And then there's a circumgulf flight where birds would tend to kind of hug the coastline as they migrate. Next. So as a means of assessing bird movements, as opposed to Noah and what I think it was John just showed, where they have wealth of data, we're kind of somewhat data poor in a lot of cases here for birds. So we're kind of put back looking at individual observations or tagging studies, and then more recently some radar ornithology work. Next. So the individual observations, this was referenced earlier, the GOMMAPPS data, a project being funded through BOEM currently. So if we look at royal terns, it's a resident bird. You see them, the dots kind of, the bigger the dot, the more individuals at that location. So they're more kind of confined to the nearshore environment, whereas something like a band rump storm petrel, this is one of those species that's kind of migrating in off the coast of Africa during mid to late summer. See, they're more in the open, the pelagic waters offshore, kind of off the shelf. So we got birds everywhere within the Gulf. Next. And then we can start looking at some of the satellite tagging efforts. And here's one example for swallowtail kites. You see the fall migration on the left. There was birds tagged in Florida. Those birds tend to funnel down through the peninsular Florida, jump off over toward Yucatan, Mexico, making their way south down to Central and South America. Whereas birds tagged in Louisiana, one went straight across and one went around, kind of a circumgulf pathway. So again, it doesn't matter. It probably depends on the winds of that specific year. Spring migration, kind of a different story. They're coming up from South America. They all go to the Yucatan, and then they jump off from there, either go straight across in towards Louisiana or angle bank over towards peninsular Florida. Next. And then we get the whimbrel, which is a larger bodied shorebird. This is an example from a Mackenzie Delta breeding population. In the fall, they make this big old crazy journey across northern Canada over to Newfoundland and then jump off into the Atlantic way offshore, landing in Belize somewhere in the winter. They come back, similar story, make their way kind of to the Yucatan and Mexico, and then either going straight across or somewhat shooting towards the U.S.-Mexico border around Brownsville and then working themselves up. Next. Again, so a couple more individual studies to show you the breadth of how birds are using the Gulf. The prothonotary example was not satellite tags, instead it was the geolocators. So it's, you get a data point, so that's why there's a lot of straight lines. Again, Yucatan's really important. Those birds are coming and going straight across to Louisiana up the Mississippi River Valley. Birds that are breeding on the Atlantic tend to follow the Atlantic seaboard down to peninsular Florida and then jump to Cuba and then down and or over to Yucatan and follow their way around. Purple martins, again, similar stories. Here we see another bird that's more of a circumgulf, wanting to hug the coastline, coming back up out of Central and South America. Next. So radar ornithology, I said it was relatively new. It's been around longer than I have. People have been tinkering with it. I don't play with radar ornithology, but my colleagues who do have really got this fine-tuned. There's an example here. The one on the right is a flock of birds, dispersing off of the dry tortugas. Next. And so we can use this sort of technology to look at both kind of a spatial and temporal relevance. And so here, the Horton et al. So you can see again that migration curves, the colored lines reflect the different weather surveillance radar stations around the Gulf. The big kind of dark purple blob there in Texas is the peak of the migration. It's about 120,000 birds, per night moving through there. Next. And then also you can use the same weather radar systems to look at kind of where the hot spots are. So the first slide was showing you kind of abundance and temporal aspects. So now you can get into where are those birds on the landscape? And so you can generate graphics and kind of hotspot maps like this one that depicts hotspots of, high densities of birds during migration. Next. So kind of to wrap that up, we've got about 400 plus, species of birds, somewhere between 2 and 4 billion birds that are utilized in the Gulf that we need to be worried about. There's variable migration pathways. From a temporal, we have a spring and fall migration. There's resident birds, there's transient birds moving in from the Caribbeans and off the coast of Africa. And then from a spatial relevance, there's kind of a general pattern somewhat forming, just kind of keeping a focus on the BOEM central and western planting areas. So the Texas coast and the Mississippi River Delta seem to be hotspots, as well as the barrier islands. A lot of times those barrier islands are the first places a bird has to rest and stop over after a long migration. And then right around the shelf break, about the 200-meter mark, that's where we start, seeing a lot of upwellings and so forth. And so the pelagic birds are kind of concentrating in that area. So those are some general hotspots to be thinking about and be mindful of as we move forward. Next. So kind of a lot of what I just showed has been referenced in some of these different data sets here. And these are kind of data sets that are kind of available that we should be thinking about as we move forward. There's all the NERDA early assessment work, some various publications or projects being funded through the Deepwater Horizon trustee groups right now. The GOMMAPPS.
So Randy.
Looks like Randy may have lost his connection.
All right, so he was covering the relevant populations. He's almost done, but there are a few more slides. I'm going to propose, just for timing, that we continue on and we can go back and finish up Randy's slides at the end. 1, 2, 3.
You have me?
Oh yeah, you're back again.
Oh, that was weird.
We lost your connection, but I also wanted to say that we're about your 10 minutes, Randy. So if we could wrap this up, would be good.
Yes, sir. Get the next slide, please, for me. One more. You got me still?
Yep, you're on.
Okay, one more click, please. There we go. So I just wanted to make reference to this Birdcast information that I made reference to as a data set. Go back one. Let me show that graphic real quick. Please, sir.
Want to go back again?
Yeah, right there. Perfect. And so this is the Birdcast information that you can skip that one. Go ahead. Is that my colleagues that are using the weather radar information, I've started building models that allows you to generate forecast models and predictions based off of bird migration. You can click to the next slide, Eric, see if they show the graphic. It'll show you graphics like this by day. So every day during migration, you can go pull up a graphic to look for hotspots of where birds might be migrating. And they've also got it fine-tuned now such that they have abundance estimates tagged with this. So it might say 325 million birds expected to be in the airspace tonight. Next. And I was going to close out. There's a few other relevant publications. I think all of these are largely funded through BOEM over the years. They will provide a lot of good baseline information related to bird movements and bird activities in the Gulf of Mexico. Next. I was going to close. Just a frame of reference, looking at bird mortality across the board in the United States. Mortality associated with wind farms and offshore platforms is fairly low, but we should not ignore that just because it is low. I mean, it's probably approaching close to a million birds a year for wind farms, kind of as we understand it. And those are onshore wind farms, by the way. Next. This is my last one. And so I just wanted to conclude that the Fish and Wildlife Service stands ready to assist in the consultation technical assistance process, from the beginning to the end. So someone said earlier, we're all in. So we're all in. It behooves us to benefit our trust resource, the migratory birds in this exercise. With that, I'll conclude. I know I probably went a couple of minutes long. Sorry about that.
All right, thank you, Randy.